There's been a lot of talk about tariffs over the last few days because, unless you live under a rock, you know that Donald Trump was elected as the next president. And one of his key proposals is a 20% blanket tariff on all imported goods. So what I want to do in this video is first and foremost explain what a tariff is and how it works, because there is some confusion around that. I also want to cover some misconceptions about tariffs, and then I want to show and highlight some real-world examples, because we have real-world examples both in history and under the previous Trump administration that will show the likely results of a tariff. Then I want to cover a very particular example using sugar, believe it or not, to explain how tariffs can impact consumers directly. And then I want to give you my thoughts on what the likely outcome, if these tariffs are implemented, is on the economy and as consumers. So with that said, as always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get started. Okay, so first and foremost, what even is a tariff, and what is its designed purpose? Well, for all intents and purposes, a tariff is a tax imposed by the government. In this case, it would be the United States government on an imported good. In this case, a 20% blanket tariff would be imposed on every foreign good imported into this country. At its core, the most basic definition, that is what a tariff is. Now, what's its purpose? It actually has three main purposes. The first is the widely known one, and that is to protect domestic industries. And it does so by increasing the cost of foreign competitors. If a foreign industry can produce a good cheaper than the US-based counterpart, that puts a strain on the US industry because it is competing with the foreign cheaper product. And in some cases, industries require tariffs to actually exist, and without tariffs and subsidies, they wouldn't exist. So in specific instances, tariffs do have a reason and a valuable purpose, but this is different from a blanket tariff. The second reason is actually to generate revenue for the government. Before income taxes were a thing, this was actually the primary way that the United States made a revenue or an income to be able to function as a government. Nowadays, of course, we have property taxes and car taxes and income taxes and state taxes and taxes on this and taxes on that, and we have taxes everywhere. But before, this was one of the primary ways that the US actually made an income to be able to function. And the third is probably the least known, and that is leverage in negotiations. The threat of a tariff or imposing a tariff on another nation can bring them to the negotiating table for better trade agreements. This isn't really known by the public, but it is a valuable tool for negotiations. But once again, these tariffs are usually precise. They're more like a scalpel, not necessarily like a hammer. Whereas a 20% tariff on all goods, blanketed across the entire import industry, is more like a hammer. So while tariffs can provide leverage, usually they are targeted at specific countries that we want to negotiate with. So the key takeaway here is tariffs are usually promoted as a way to protect domestic industries from cheaper foreign counterparts, but in reality, they have three main purposes. Okay, now that we understand what a tariff is, I want to talk about the primary misconception that I've seen propagated throughout the internet. And in fact, Donald Trump himself has gone on record stating that when it comes to a tariff, the foreign nation pays it.
You're not paying for those tariffs. China's paying for those tariffs.
The tariffs are not being paid for by our people. It's being paid for by China.
China's paying the tariffs.
Our country can take in $120 billion a year in tariffs, paid for mostly by China, by the way. These tariffs are paid for largely by China.
Our people aren't paying for those tariffs. In that case, certainly, China's paying for them.
This is not the case. In almost every single instance of a tariff being applied, the importer, which means companies based in the nation that is promoting the tariff, will pay for it. That means companies in the United States. And a lot of the times, that also means consumers, because while there are some exceptions and there are some companies that have massive profit margins, a lot of companies, especially ones that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, Walmart comes to mind, have very narrow profit margins, which means that they do not have the ability to absorb a tariff, especially not a 20% tariff when most goods are imported. So, for example, Walmart has anywhere between a 2 to 3% profit margin. So if you put a 20% tariff on all goods, Walmart is going to have to pass that cost on to consumers simply because it does not have the economic power to absorb it. Some other businesses that rely heavily on imports are things like Home Depot and Amazon. Think about businesses that sell a lot of different brands. These businesses, a lot of the time, we interact with on a daily basis. And a lot of these businesses do not have the margin to be able to absorb the entirety of the tariff, which means not only does the importing nation and the importing company pay the tariff, but we as consumers, a lot of the time, bear the brunt of the cost through increased prices. And a good example of this is a study done by NBER, or the National Bureau of Economic Research. They found that some tariffs done under the previous Trump administration, known as the China tariffs, were completely absorbed by the consumer, with no evidence whatsoever that exporting companies paid any of the cost. And finally, when it comes to the misconception of who pays for the tariffs, another thing that we have to realize as consumers is not only are we most likely to bear the cost of increased prices because of these companies not being able to absorb it, but we also have to understand that domestic industries will face less competition from foreign companies, which means that domestic industries, when facing less competition, might be inclined to raise their prices themselves due to that lack of competition. Okay, now that we understand what a tariff is and who actually pays for it, I want to cover a couple of very key, specific historic instances where tariffs were used and their outcomes on the economy. The first is by the Trump administration themselves last time they were in office. This is Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, which imposed 25% and 10% tariffs respectively, affecting about $48 billion worth of imports. And the economic result of this? U.S. manufacturing job losses outweighed any benefits that were experienced by the steel industry. In fact, the Federal Reserve itself estimated that about 75,000 job losses in U.S. manufacturing were directly contributed to this tariff. Also, the higher steel prices led to higher costs in the automobile and construction industries. And you know what that means. If their prices to produce goods, cars, homes, and buildings increase, then our costs to buy those things, primarily cars and houses, also go up. So while in general, tariffs, when used appropriately, are targeted at specific industries, even in some instances, it can cause negative economic effects. But since Trump is proposing a blanket tariff, I want to use another example from our history of severe tariffs and their effects on the economy. And in order to do that, we need to talk about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And this tariff act imposed tariffs on over 20,000 different imported goods into the United States during the Great Depression. Now, its goal was, again, to protect U.S. industry. But instead, what happened, and it's something that we have to be aware of this time around, is retaliatory tariffs. Other nations, in response to this act, imposed tariffs of their own on the United States. And the Council on Foreign Relations found that it collapsed global trade by 67%. This tariff act has now become infamous for its causes on global trade and for prolonging the Great Depression, which most economists agree is exactly what it did. And another example, before we talk about my favorite, which is sugar tariffs, is another set of tariffs by the previous Trump administration between 2018 and 2019, which are the China tariffs. These tariffs targeted about $360 billion worth of imported goods. And the result? Consumers paid about 10% more, or in dollar terms, about $32 billion more for the same goods in just 2018 alone. And industries like agriculture were hit particularly hard because of China's retaliatory tariffs on us. The most widely known one is the retaliatory tariff on soybeans, which caused a massive 53% drop in exports. Okay, now let's talk about sugar tariffs, which in my opinion are fascinating, and they show the direct impact on consumers on a tariff that was created to protect American industry. So in order to talk about this, we have to go back almost 100 years to the Sugar Act of 1934. Now, what this act did was impose tariffs and import quotas on foreign sugar. Now, it did this to protect domestic sugar production. Since American sugar production has higher costs associated, it wasn't able to compete with foreign sugar. And this is where it gets interesting. Almost 100 years later, we, the consumers, are still dealing with the costs of this. And the easiest way to see this is with Coca-Cola and Pepsi. If you look at Coca-Cola or Pepsi outside of the United States, for example, in Mexico, and you grab a bottle and you spin it around and you look at the ingredients, the primary sweetener is going to be cane sugar. Yet, if you grab that same bottle of Coke or Pepsi inside the United States, more than likely, you're going to see high fructose corn syrup as the primary sweetener. Now, this has been going on for decades, about 40 years, and the reason is because of these tariffs, if possible, companies are going to look for a cheaper alternative. And Coca-Cola and Pepsi, as well as many other companies that create our favorite foods, looked to high fructose corn syrup as a replacement for sugar because, according to the American Enterprise Institute, sugar inside America costs double the global average. So, directly because of these tariffs, we, the consumers, not only pay more for the same product because prices for the same product inside America are more expensive than outside America, but we pay more for arguably a less quality good. We are using high fructose corn syrup instead of cane sugar specifically because of a tariff. And there is debate whether high fructose corn syrup causes obesity or if it's the same as sugar. The fact of the matter is, it's most likely worse because of its higher content of fructose, but even ignoring that, we are simply getting a product that tastes less good than the foreign counterpart simply because we have to pay so much more for sugar in this country, which in turn makes companies seek out cheaper alternatives, and us, the consumer, not only pay higher costs for those goods because of tariffs, but we also pay higher costs when it comes to potentially the quality of the product and our health. To me, this Sugar Tariff Act of 1934 is one of the most fascinating examples of how a good thing, a targeted tariff to protect an industry, can end up being a bad thing that benefits less people than it hurts. It benefits the sugar industry and the employees that they employ, but it affects negatively basically the rest of the US population. Okay, now we know what a tariff is, we understand some of the common misconceptions, and we've gone over multiple examples of how a tariff can negatively affect the economy. So then, why is there so much talk around a tariff? Are there any possible benefits? Well, the main possible benefit is that tariffs can incentivize companies to produce goods inside the United States to avoid having to pay that tariff. One of the best examples of this, and while not directly the same, is what's going on in the electric vehicle industry. Not only is there a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles, but there is also a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles that are made inside the United States. These two things have caused a massive surge in companies trying to create those vehicles inside the country to be able to take advantage of the $7,500 tax credit. And electric vehicle manufacturers in China are basically barred unless they create factories here from selling because they won't be able to compete. So there have been some talks and some rumors that some of those companies might put factories here. So yes, there can be positives when it comes to tariffs, but usually the positives are in the form of direct pointed tariffs at certain specific industries or to certain countries. A blanket tariff, on the other hand, will most likely increase prices and increase inflation for the average consumer. And in fact, a study done by Donald Trump's alma mater itself, the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School of Business, found that these tariffs would effectively reduce the average household's income by $2,031 annually. And not only that, but the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, has found that past tariffs have increased inflation by close to 0.5%. And going back to the potential blanket tariffs, the Congressional Budget Office, known as the CBO, estimates that these tariffs would lower real GDP by 0.5% in the first year alone. And it could potentially stall GDP growth entirely, depending on how much retaliatory tariffs are placed on us by other nations. So, in my opinion, is a 25% blanket tariff on all imports a good idea or a bad idea? Well, while I do believe that tariffs in specific instances can be beneficial, a blanket tariff across all goods is probably going to hurt us more than it helps us economically, and that has to do with a concept known as comparative advantage. You see, in economics, companies or countries can specialize in certain things, and if we all specialize in the thing that we do best, it makes the global economy more efficient. The US is a service-based economy, which means we are very good at creating services in the tech and financial fields, as well as many other fields. Why? Well, because we have a lot of higher education here, and because we have a lot of the existing tech companies in nation. Other countries have other comparative advantages. For example, China has a comparative advantage on labor, for better or for worse. China produces things for lower cost than we do because their labor is cheaper because they have more of it. So because of this, when we start implementing tariffs, we start creating friction in the natural efficiency of a global economy. Now, I'm not here to talk about whether that's morally correct or not. I understand there are some reservations about the labor laws in other countries. What I'm here to say is, will these tariffs affect the U.S. economy and the U.S. consumer positively or negatively? And in my opinion, the overall effect is most likely going to be a net negative. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. There are many notable economists who also agree.